Hi, welcome back. My name's Ernie Hall, and this is part two of our video series on Unitarian Universalists and UUSS history. So hopefully you remember from part one that we started by talking about the beliefs of the early Unitarians and Universalists that Jesus was not God, but a great teacher, that God was a unity, a, a unified being, and the Universalists that God was really all loving and would not condemn anyone to eternal punishment. We saw the development of the early religion of Unitarianism, starting with Michael Servetus in Spain at the time of the Protestant Revolution, and then moving to Eastern Europe, to Transylvania with Francis David, and then back to England, where over the 1600s and 1700s, Unitarianism slowly grew and eventually was able to establish itself. We saw how Unitarianism moved to the United States in the person of Joseph Priestley, who settled in Philadelphia in 1794 and greatly influenced the founding fathers of this country. We also saw that Unitarianism also got a foothold in the United States, in New England, where many of the Puritan and Pilgrim Congregationalist churches decided to convert to Unitarianism in the period of 1790 to 1620. Eventually, by the early 1800s, there were a number of very famous Unitarian and Universalist ministers in Boston. And Boston was really the center of both Unitarian and Universalist thought. Now, Universalism in particular, as I mentioned in part one, was very much a grassroots religion. So there were many small Universalist congregations throughout the United States. In New York State, for example, there were, in some counts, over 100 Universalist chapels. So the two religions were thriving in the early 1800s. We also talked about how Unitarianism in particular took a theological turn with the onset of transcendentalism, which was developed by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a Unitarian minister, where transcendentalism stresses religion as a deeply personal experience and encourages people to use their senses to connect with the divine all around them. And we relate that back to our principle of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So that brings us up to the Civil War, and a time when there will be some significant changes in both Unitarianism and Universalism. So let's begin with our slides at this point. During the Civil War, for every one soldier that was killed on the battlefield, 2 soldiers died in camps, prisoner of war camps, hospitals from disease. And because of this, a number of Unitarian and Universalist ministers and others went to President Lincoln and told him he needed to do something about this, and asked him to appoint a sanitary commission whose responsibility would be to raise money and bring supplies to these camps and hospitals. And he did that. And many UU women, Unitarians and Universalists, served in the Sanitary Commission. Famous women in American history, like Julia Ward Howe, shown here, Dorothea Dix, Clara Barton, and they did tremendously good work. And at the end of the Civil War, they wanted to continue doing this social justice work. And so they turned their attention to other causes. Dorothea Dix, many know, spent the rest of her life working to improve the condition of mental hospitals. Clara Barton started the Red Cross. Julia Ward Howe did many things. She wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She wrote a letter to the president calling for a Mother's Day of Peace, which is one of the drivers for our current Mother's Day. But in particular, she encouraged the equality of women and the formation of the women's movement, the women's suffrage movement, the vote for women in the United States during this time. And she very much encouraged the Unitarian and Universalist religions to allow the ordination of women. Now, that was fairly unheard of at the time. But soon after, or actually during the Civil War, the Universalists began to allow women ministers. And not too long after that, the Unitarians did. The first Universalist minister was Olympia Brown. The first Unitarian minister was Antoinette Louisa Brown, no relation. And these women, their ministries and the ministries of many other women really started to transform Unitarianism and Universalism and really solidify the thrust toward social justice as an incredibly important part of the religious experience. By 1920, there were 88 Universalist women ministers and 42 Unitarian women ministers, at a time when, as far as I know, no other major religion was allowing women into the ministry or priesthood. So this was quite an important development, and one that has continued to transform our religion up to the present time. So as far as sort of the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, we have Unitarianism and Universalism as religions that are very strongly oriented toward social justice. And in particular, in the Unitarian case, very strongly influenced by transcendentalism, so that there is tremendous diversity of thought and toleration of individual beliefs in Unitarianism in particular. And that has continued, of course, until the present day. But there's one additional sort of philosophical thrust that became important to both Unitarianism and Universalism at this time. And that is humanism, which came into popularity, if you will, in the early 1900s, particularly after the horrors of the First World War. There was a great thrust to try to focus on how we could act collectively to make sure something like that never happened again. So humanism, as you probably know, really speaks to the common destiny of all people, that we are all in this together, that we must help each other. Now we would also say the common destiny of all existence, where we would pull in the caring for the earth as part of that humanist philosophy. And humanism, of course, is inherent in universalism, the idea that all people are worthy of God's love, all people are valuable. And so that was a very easy uh, adoption of these principles. Um, for Unitarianism, it's interesting to see how humanism and transcendentalism are sort of counterpoint. And you see that in our current principles, that on the one hand, we encourage each individual person to develop their own answers to the most important questions in history, in life. And on the other hand, we ask that everyone work for the betterment of all. So there's the collective and the individual, and that's sort of a complementary and really gives Unitarian Universalism its richness and continues to be a very distinctive part of our religion. Unitarianism, in particular, by this point, is non-creedal. That sort of is inherent in the transcendentalist message and to some extent the humanist message. So again, great diversity of thought in Unitarianism in particular. Here we see two of the leading humanists of both religions, Unitarian John Haynes Holmes here and Universalist Clarence Skinner. They were actually key in writing the so-called Humanist Manifesto, which defined humanism in 1933. And of the 34 leaders that signed the Humanist Manifesto, 14 were UU ministers. They worked also to found very important social justice organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People during that time. And they promoted what is often called the social gospel. This is a reaction to social Darwinism. Now, you know Darwin and his theory of evolution. By the way, Darwin was a Unitarian. Social Darwinism says, well, survival of the fittest, that we don't have a responsibility to the weakest among us, that, you know, evolution, Darwinism would say, you know, the fit survive and others perhaps do not. Humanism, of course, takes the exact opposite focus and says we all have to help everyone thrive in this world. So they were very fond of talking about the social gospel. So that was a very, very important movement going forward into the 20th century. So we get to late in the 20th century, time to talk about how the two religions formally got together. Merger talks actually began as early as 1931, but it took 30 years to work out the details. The first programs to actually merge were the youth programs because we were sharing a common RE curriculum. So that happened in 1953. Finally, by 1961, all the details had been worked out and a formal merger took place between Unitarianism and Universalism to form the new religion. And the Unitarian Reverend Dana Greeley was elected the first president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Well, the first real test of this new religion came in perhaps an unusual place, Selma, Alabama. Now, again, many of you know the story of Selma. Reverend Martin Luther King was leading a march for voting rights from Selma to Birmingham. His first attempt failed as they were turned back by the police in Selma, walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Martin Luther King puts out a call for people of faith to come to Selma and march for voting rights. This is 1965. 200 UU ministers and thousands of lay UUs stopped what they were doing and went to Selma to march with Martin Luther King. Now, you can imagine the courage it took to do that, knowing that once you got there, you could very likely be beaten, uh, arrested, harassed in every way, and maybe even killed. So this was a tremendously proud moment for Unitarians and Universalists. Unfortunately, of the three people killed at Selma, two of them were UUs, Reverend James Reed from Boston and Viola Liuzzo, who was a congregational member from Chicago. But because of us stepping up in this way, the Black membership of UU congregations grew rapidly during the late 1960s. Unfortunately, this story does not have a happy ending. The Black membership of the Unitarian Universalist Association formed a Black Affairs Committee and asked the UUA for money to continue to grow Black majority UU congregations. The General Assembly of the UUA voted to give them $1 million. But after they got the first quarter of that money, the UUA realized that it was the Treasury was bankrupt and there was no more money. So they had to renege on the rest of the money. Well, unfortunately, this led the Black leaders, Black UU leaders, to feel that really we didn't live up to our promises, and Black membership in our congregations dropped rapidly after that. So that was a very, very painful time in the new association. The 60s and 70s, 1960s and 1970s, were also a turbulent time in many other ways. The Vietnam War was causing quite a bit of controversy in many of the congregations as people debated the worth of that war. We've already talked about Black empowerment. Women's rights was an important issue. The whole free love movement was something that liberal UUs were at least interested in. And LGBT anti-discrimination was beginning to come to the fore in our congregations. Fortunately, learning from the experience with people of color becoming part of our congregations, when our congregations and our UUA moved forward to try to support LGBTQ people, they didn't make the same mistakes and have been consistently supportive and fulfilling their promises. And that has been a much more successful thrust in our congregations since then. The General Assembly actually passed the first resolution opposing LGBT discrimination in 1970, and our denominations called the first openly gay minister in 1979. This congregation actually called a minister who was gay in the mid 1980s, and we can talk more about that when we talk about the history of our congregation. So as we move forward, what were some of the most important efforts that came about in the end of the 20th century? Well, in 1989, the UUA and our congregations officially became interested in programs on climate justice and developed the Green Sanctuary program, of which our congregation is a part. The Partner Church Council was also established the same year. That was to partner American churches with churches in Eastern Europe, which were just emerging after the fall of the Iron Curtain. We'll talk more about that, and again, when we talk about the history of our congregation. The UUA General Assembly continues to push for LGBT rights, fully supporting marriage equality in 1996. And as we're very proud to know that our UUA president, Bill Sinkford, shown here, actually performed the first US same-sex marriage in 2004 on the very day that the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled for marriage equality, and was the first day that same-sex marriages could be performed in the United States. Spiritual deepening became another important program in our congregation starting around 2000, bringing together small groups of people to discuss some of the most important questions in life. Covenant circles, which still go on, and Wellspring, which started in the Rochester congregation, are two examples of our current spiritual deepening programs. And finally, as we move to what's happening right now, we know that Side with Love came about a few years ago, really to champion all of the marginalized and oppressed people, immigrants, migrants, LGBTQ, people of color, broad spectrum of different people who are often do not have a strong and powerful voice in our nation, and that's one of the big advantages of having a UUA, a Unitarian Universalist Association, is we have someone who can, our UUA president can speak for liberal religion to the powers that be and give the alternative view to some of the other messages that politicians often hear. Wellspring continues to be a centerpiece of our spiritual deepening programs, and you'll hear more about that, I think, a little later in getting to know UU. There's been, starting again about 7 years ago, a major effort in our congregations to explore and oppose white supremacy culture, to look deep within ourselves, in our congregations, and in our society, to see the effects of white supremacy and how to combat those. An organization called Black Lives of UU is trying to do what we tried to do 50 years ago, and that is build participation from people of color in our UU congregations. Climate justice, green sanctuary continues to be incredibly important in many congregations. And finally, 6 years ago, we elected our first female UUA president, Susan Frederick Gray, shown here. And her term just ended, and the new UU president, Sonia Betancourt, is now taking office. Finally, UU the Vote came about over just the last few years, a nonpartisan effort to try to get out the vote to support the sort of liberal causes that UUs feel so passionate about. So that's the end of the story of our history. I hope that was interesting and informative to you. We'll have time in person to talk about some of this, answer any questions you might have, and fill in a few of the blanks. So I look forward to seeing you all in person, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.